Thank you, Madam Speaker. I stand here giving my address on the land of the Muwinina people, and I want to acknowledge their elders, past and their current emerging leaders and the people who live amongst us today. This is land which was stolen across the whole of Tasmania, the Palawa Pakana, and we as a party and as a state must be committed to returning lands and to establishing a treaty and to changing the date of Australia Day to a day which is appropriate for everyone in this country. Something which was extraordinary was the inaugural Ballawini Festival, Dark Emu Ballawini Festival, that was held in Cygnet in this January. And it was extraordinary. It was organised by the South East Tasmanian Aboriginal Corporation and some other people because it was a festival of Aboriginal philosophy. And it is truly a time where we need to open our minds and our hearts and our ears to how Aboriginal people successfully lived on this land for tens of thousands of years, because they were people who survived multiple ice ages and they survived conditions which most people in Tasmania could never imagine living through. And we have so much to learn about the philosophy of life and death and the connection to place that Aboriginal people in Tasmania can give to us all. It was a beautiful sharing of ideas. The headline person who spoke, of course, Bruce Pascoe, is now widely respected in Tasmania for his incredible book, Dark Emu, which documents it is amazing, which documents in a very simple form the evidence recorded from explorers' diaries around the country of their first observation of Aboriginal societies as they attended to different places. And I'll rephrase that, Madam Speaker, and it just goes to show how I've been indoctrinated through my education that I use the term explorer. There was no exploration going on. It was an invasion of the country, which was owned by many different Aboriginal peoples around Australia. As people came in to take land, the first people who came in did make records, and that is the substance of Bruce Pascoe's book. And it shows the amazing richness of Aboriginal societies. And we must learn the lessons that Aboriginal people live with and can teach us today. Jamie Grahams-Blair, who is a young and very just inspiring Aboriginal leader from Tasmania, spoke yesterday on the radio about the importance of seeing Aboriginal philosophy and Aboriginal society as a whole. And he said, you can't pick and choose the bits that you like. So it's not up to non-Aboriginal people to just delve into Aboriginal society and think that we can take a bit of burning practice or a bit of something else about culture, extract it, commercialise it, utilise it, consume it for our own purposes without looking at the whole context of Aboriginal philosophy. Really important point, and one which we will continue to work with Aboriginal people in Tasmania to understand the knowledge that they have and to work together in the challenges that face us. So taking stock of the start of 2020 must start with us recognising that we have so much more to do to amend to provide justice to Aboriginal Tasmanians and to provide them with a real voice in the democracy. It's also, as we take stock, incredible to think that this time last year there had not been a global school strike for climate. There had not been a global climate rally. What a lot of change has happened in just 1 year. what a tremendous movement is taking place across the planet, not just from school children, of course, although they've led the charge in Australia, but from all people who understand the science and who are looking and listening to the 11,000 scientific experts who have given us a very clear deadline of 2030. They understand we're in a climate emergency, and they are warning us that if we do not radically reduce our emissions by 2030, we don't get to have any say in the changes that will be unstoppable in the global climate system. In many parts of the system, we have already, it seemed, passed some tipping points. But there is still a prospect if we focus and put all of our energies into understanding we're in a climate crisis. There is still a prospect of being able to stop the feedback loops which would make this planet uninhabitable for humans within, the predictions now are ranging from 2070 onwards. We don't want to argue, Madam Speaker, about a couple of decades when we're talking about the habitability of this planet. We want to understand that when we hear from the Bureau of Meteorology that since the 1950s, summers in Australia are now on average 31 days longer than they were back then. And that's just in the past 20 years, our summers have increased by 31 days compared to that 1950 period. In the past 20 years, that is an incredibly short amount of time. That's an average across the country too. In parts of the country, like in Port Macquarie, 48 days longer. We have far, far shorter winters than we ever had. And those of us who live in Tasmania know we don't want to wish winter away. We love winter. Winter is the reason that we have berries. Winter is the reason that we have security from fruit fly. Winter is the reason that we love to go to the snow and be outside. It's not something to wish away. It is something to hold on and nurture. We love winter. Winter brings us protection. It brings us food that other places don't have. It brings us a sense of camaraderie. It brings us the Dark Mofo Festival, for goodness sake. So, these are things to celebrate and to understand what loss means. The drought on the mainland is something that we have watched on the screens for 6 months for those of us who live in Tasmania. People who live in farms on the mainland are affected every day and continue to be affected. Whole towns are on the verge, if they have not already run out of drinking water. Whole farming regions are becoming unfarmable. This is not normal. This is the longest and most severe drought that's ever been recorded in Australian history. It is a dust bowl in Western New South Wales. It is a place where parts of the sides of rivers have disappeared that Aboriginal people in tens of thousands of years have never seen the loss of their trees and vegetation in those areas. There is deep grief, Madam Speaker, amongst Aboriginal people, amongst farming communities, and amongst all of the people who are supported by those farming communities. Deep grief for not just the loss of livelihoods, but the loss of history, the loss of memory, which is situated in those trees, in that vegetation, in those animals that have survived for as long as humans can remember in those areas. What we've seen, the bushfires that have occurred as a response to that super drying in eastern Australia was such an emotional experience for the people who suffered through them. And as somebody who happened to be on the mainland myself, I was personally affected by, I knew myself 3 people whose houses burnt down. I had my husband's whole family stuck for 2 days, including 80 and 90-year-old relatives on the beach in Malua Bay. I had people who were living in whole townships, Gabargo, gone. Places that cannot be rebuilt in the way they were. It is not like we can put back the industries of regions in parts of New South Wales and Victoria that have lost their whole apple processing plants, that have lost their whole tourism industry plant, that have lost their whole dairy, milking, processing areas. These aren't things that a fairy godmother will come along and just start them up again, because many of those industries were marginal already. And so what we're looking at is a whole re-understanding of parts of New South Wales and Victoria, and we don't know where that's going to end, where communities are going to go. It's a work in progress. But along with the people and the impact on houses, there was 10 times more houses burnt, according to the New South Wales Fire Commissioner, 10 times more houses burnt than have ever been burnt in a bushfire experience before. There were at least 33 people who lost their lives, numbers of them being volunteer firefighters. And there were whole communities who suffered through months of smoke, which had levels far higher than recorded anywhere else on the planet at the time. The impact on people who suffered from lung conditions, we don't know how many people died as a result of that, but the evidence is there. The relationship between smoke inhalation and mortality is very strong. So people did die. People must have died. The evidence tells us. We're waiting to see what the results will be because of that smoke. Madam Speaker, along with the impacts of the humans living there, we know that more than 1 billion animals perished in those fires, and we all would have seen traumatising images of burnt koalas and so many other burnt animals. It brought out the best in Australians. It brought out amazing community spirit, which gave me so much hope to see how people came together to support each other, rejected the false sense of community that was offered by the Prime Minister when he tried to insert his hand into some poor woman who had survived bushfires in southeastern New South Wales after he had vacated his role and responsibility. That's the sort of... They rejected that false community because people knew what mattered, and it was people being true and people being real to themselves in hardship. And Bruce Pascoe, mind you, Madam Speaker, he who was lambasted on the pages of The Australian and by numerous Liberal members of Parliament, attacked at the very same time as that man was fighting to save his house and the houses of his friends in Malakuta. He had to chainsaw his way out through burnt forests and limbs, and to open roads for his community, and to get himself out to come to Tasmania to the Ballawinnie Festival. So this is yet another one of the Australian heroes who worked together in community. And I want to pay tribute to the leadership of Shane Fitzwilliams, who spoke to me, and I suppose from everyone who watched during that period on the TV screens, Shane Fitzwilliams was the Chief Commissioner of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. He showed us what leadership looked like. He was always compassionate. He flew to speak in person to the wives and children of the men who were firefighters who lost their lives. He showed us strength and clarity. He called the situation as it was. He talked about the climate change charging of the atmosphere and the impact it was having on the fires. He, along with 30 other Australians, sought last year to speak to our Prime Minister and warn of the catastrophe that happened this summer. 3 times, Madam Speaker, they were knocked back. One of those 31 was Mike Brown, our own previous Tasmanian Chief Fire Commissioner. Other people understand what's going on. We must come together and act with the time that we've got available to us. And it is not an endless amount of time, Madam Speaker. It's a very diminishing amount of time. Because along with the understanding of the gravity of the situation, we have a tremendous energy which is building in the community, and people fought back against the Liberals, who were the climate deniers in the Liberal Party, who were trying to pretend that climate change wasn't part of it. People whose houses burnt down on the mainland, they were the ones tweeting, this was climate change that burnt my house down. The farmers who were losing their stock and their livelihoods, they were the ones tweeting that. We know this is true. The scientists know this is true. This year, the Greens will be working with everyone in Tasmania who understands the urgency on this climate crisis, and we will be focusing 100% of our energy towards bringing a legislative agenda to Parliament, putting pressure on government to take action, serious action on the climate emergency. And what are we doing that for, Madam Speaker? It's because we know that Tasmanians want a safe future. Above all, that's what children and young people are feeling anxious about. They want a safe future. They want security in the future. They want to have a healthy life. They want to have a life which is filled with happiness and well-being. And they understand that unless we sort this climate thing out, everything else doesn't mean a thing, because it's just not worth putting pen to paper about. That is the bottom line. Young people understand this. It is causing the lack of leadership shown by governments is causing a rise in a term, solastalgia, which is a new psychological definition. It's an international definition. Loss of connection with nature. It's caused a new term in the Macquarie Dictionary this year, eco-anxiety. This is what young people are tweeting about. But the response to that, Madam Speaker, has been an equal rise in awareness of our health providers. And in Tasmania, a wonderful group, the Climate Resilience Network, has established GPs, psychologists, psychiatrists, people who understand, educators of children, people who understand, and they say that children, young people, need to have action to build climate resilient communities and organisations. It is through taking action that people will best be able to adapt to the changing climate. And only in a few weeks' time, in a few months' time, on the 30th of April, there will be in Tasmania for the first time the Australian Association for Bush Adventure Therapy, their national conference. What a wonderful thing. Finally we have this amazing organisation here in Tasmania. It's a great opportunity for us. We understand the relationship between nature and health. This is yet another part of the story about responding to the climate emergency. So this year we will be focusing on climate change action and protecting nature. We will be recognising that the current woefully inadequate State Climate Act is well past its use-by date. It was an important start 11 years ago, but other than some work that was done by the Greens when they were climate change ministers from 2010 to 2014, effectively nothing has happened. This government killed off the Climate Advisory Council, and it has killed off effective action on sectoral targets. So we will be introducing a bill that recognises that we are in a climate emergency, that understands that we need to that we have until 2030 to make massive reductions in emissions, or the world's climate will move into an uncontrollable and increasingly uninhabitable state. Our bill is going to be based on the best available science, and instead of setting some far-off target of 2040 or 2050, which kicks the responsibility to governments in the future, we would set targets to bring down emissions across all sectors in every year. We will set targets and mandate statewide plans that need to be prepared every 4 years to achieve emissions reduction within each sector, to increase and protect our stores of carbon, and to develop climate adaptation plans at state and local government levels. This is a Tasmania-specific bill, Madam Speaker. It recognises the gains that we've already made in the clean energy sector, but they're not enough. They're absolutely not enough, and we must use this advantage in the clean electricity sector to electrify transport, to electrify agriculture, and to make the big gains that we can and must make. The bill establishes a joint standing Safe Climate Committee, and it would also establish an independent Safe Climate Commission of experts who would provide frank and fearless and science-based advice to government and the community about the actions that we need to take for the climate emergency. This is legislation that would set us on a pathway to a future that's more safe and that's better for the health and well-being of everyone in Tasmania. Now, Madam Speaker, along with that important piece of legislation, which we will work with other parties and bring it on in the spirit of trying to find cross-party unity on this matter, we also understand that we have to keep carbon stores in the ground locked up that we already have. And so we cannot ignore the issue of forestry. Our emissions at the moment in Tasmania are currently effectively only within a few percent of where they were 30 years ago. And that's because we have had rapidly growing native forests thanks to the forestry agreement. But if we ignore emissions from all the other sectors in the Tasmanian economy, we have been increasing. If we look at the emissions from all the sectors in the Tasmanian forestry economy, other than the forests which have regrown because of the forest agreement, then what we find is we've been increasing in 2016, 2017 relative to 30 years ago. So we must change that. We must not return to large-scale native forest logging. In fact, we have to stop large-scale native forest logging. We have to not log any trees in the 356,000 hectares of forests, and we have to make real emissions reductions in each other sector of the economy. Madam Speaker, crimes against the environment affects everyone, and the situation in the United Kingdom is a light on the hill for us as a people across the planet, because what's happened is a legal case against the Heathrow Airport expansion just last week was pitting the need to tackle the climate crisis against the economic arguments that were put up by the developers to extend the runway for a third runway. And what happened is that the judges found, on behalf of the people of the United Kingdom and us as a planet, and they found that the impact on the climate of emissions from a third runway, which would be 260,000 extra flights a year, would jeopardise the UK's ability to make deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. That's an incredibly important point. They recognise the failure of the development of the Assessment Authority to take account of the UK's international obligations under the Paris Agreement. This ruling, Madam Speaker, is a warning note to this government and to all governments that the climate crisis means that we cannot take business as usual as our operating metric. So in future, for economic and business decisions to have legal standing and political credibility, they have to take account of impacts on global heating. And the impact itself of that legal decision will filter down through every country on this planet. And meanwhile, Madam Speaker, the Greens in Tasmania understand that we need to focus on this issue of bringing to account people and corporations who violate the principles of environmental justice. It is a gap in our Tasmanian law. When people or corporations cause extensive damage to ecosystems or destroy them, there is currently no mechanism within the criminal code to call these people to account. When people take actions that harm the health and well-being of other species, including our own species, Madam Speaker, including us humans, by their developments or by their active destruction of landscapes, they need to be held to account. So I can foreshadow that we will be bringing this year some legislation on an ecocide bill, and that seeks to take account of the deficit in the criminal code of Tasmania, whereby people and corporations are not held, not able to be charged and convicted when they cause extreme damage to the environment and to the human beings and other animals and plants within that environment. Madam Speaker, the Greens have long been concerned that the state's laws do not sufficiently allow for the environment's interests to be protected. The history of the failure of our laws to protect the Macquarie Harbour ecosystem from rapacious fish farming, which caused known permanent damage to places and to values of the World Heritage Area, as well as to other plants and animals within the Macquarie Harbour. That experience, rather than providing the evidence that the Liberals should have taken for the problem with the laws, it just emboldened them to go in harder. And since that period in 2015, this government has weakened the regulations and laws surrounding the expansion and development and operation of fish farming in Tasmania. And that is a matter of disgrace. And the approvals around Storm Bay and that massive expansion of doubling of the fish farm industries around Tasmania has been a corrupted process. It is well understood to be a corrupted process. The Marine Farm Planning Review Panel is a joke. It has the Minister's final sign-off, and it is just... it's just an opportunity to tick a box and to pretend to people who aren't watching that there is some form of scientific credibility and independent assessment happening. But actually, Madam Speaker, that's so far from the truth. And we understand that until the Minister no longer has the final say over development applications, and until the Marine Farming Review Panel is properly constituted, that there will be no possibility of development application of developers having to respond to concerns from the community and to the science. Mr Deputy Speaker,
Members,
how much more time
your time has expired.
Have I?
Member for Braddon and Rolla.